Teach us, Kevin.
Wonderful.
Arthur, why are you laughing at your friend? Okay.
Because I
Anyway,
know.
so this is I'm continuing with a theme about ego, arrogance, etc. So another thing in the Pasha is when after the plague of the the wild beasts, um, Pharaoh said he would release the Jews, then he changed his mind again, and then Moshe. Just okay. Okay, it says here he allowed in the Qur'an, he offered to let Israel bring offerings to Hashem only on his terms. So that means he didn't really think that Hashem was a powerful entity. And the arrogant people think they're Hashem. They think the world revolves around them. And as we discussed the last two occasions, when people are arrogant, there's no rational thinking, and the world revolves around them. And so maybe he didn't really believe in Hashem, and even though his heart was hardened, he didn't really give much importance or chashuvas to it because of his own arrogance and ego. And in the previous parsha, actually before in Bereshit, before this last parsha in Bereshit, when Joseph revealed himself to the brothers, they had to eat separately because shepherds were regarded as lowlifes by the Egyptians because the sheep was actually one of their gods. So this all ties into the when people think they're superior with arrogance and ego, and that the world revolves around them, and they God in the world, and we should. I hope I don't behave like that or ever become like that.
No, listen, I think, Kevin, firstly, a couple of things is that I think instead of thinking us as lowlifes, if we looked after their gods, they should have been grateful. That's just on a logical basis. But on a separate note, on a real note, the Ramban, Nachmanides, I think it was, that said that Paro's heart was hardened, but it never took away his free choice. His entire reason why his heart was hardened is because under normal circumstances, say you've got a bully, and that bully goes around smacking people, and finally he comes up to his match and he gets himself beaten to pieces. Okay? It's not that he's say he picks on a small guy and the guy's like a 10th Dan and like mangles him into hospital. This guy has not stopped becoming a bully. He merely knows not to bully this particular individual. Do you get what I'm saying? His inherent nature hasn't changed. And why the Ramban said his heart was hardened is because under normal pressure, the entire people were complaining that he was putting Egypt in jeopardy. And he was getting a lot of political pressure, even though he was the king. Make no mistake, you say, but if you're the king, you can do anything. You know how many how many emperors in Rome were poisoned or killed? Just because one's on the alpha male hierarchy doesn't mean you can't get poisoned by somebody on the lower hierarchy if you're bad for the country. History is littered with kings that thought that they were beyond reproach. So Hashem hardened his heart so that his free choice would in fact remain, and he wouldn't succumb to external pressure of a plague where he couldn't bear it anymore. So it was in order to create his free choice. Just thought I'd share.
Yeah.
No, that's
I just
very
want to put this
interesting. I've
book
never
in the
heard
way
that.
once. I'll be
And that's
20 seconds.
actually the best explanation I've ever heard for that. Well done.
Thank you. I learned it from Rabbi Larry Sussman. Arthur remembers Rabbi Larry Sussman. When we were learning Derech Hashem.
Jesus, what a clever comment. I've never ever heard that.
Say that again. Just repeat that. Sorry.
And it's the one that makes the most sense.
Can you repeat it for me?
But the Ramban, you heard it. It wasn't a new comment since you went away. Same comment in terms of. Kev, what we're going to do is just. Gavin was on the mark yesterday. It was pretty impressive. So we're just going to say that there was a different way to learn the preceding discussion. Because what happened with the preceding discussion is we said, look, the first discussion went as follows. We don't know if Rabbi Meir holds that the stolen items and the byproducts are returned because, number one, he holds that a change does not affect acquisition, meaning because the article physically changed from a fetus to a calf, it doesn't affect a acquisition for the robber who has to pay the financial cash equivalent. That could be the one reason. The other reason is that it's a penalty upon the robber. Okay? And there are people that say that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition, and some people that say that it does, but the majority opinion is that even when we went through those opposing opinions, they were not conclusive. He said in a certain circumstance, there might be an exception, but that is the general consensus of how each of them hold. So, in this particular case, we don't know if it's a penalty that Rabbi Meir holds against the robber. And we say, where does it have an effect? This is what we discussed on Sunday. As we said, it has an effect when it comes to depreciation of the animal. Because all of a sudden then, the robber stole an animal that was worth 150 zuz, and it's now worth about 100 zuz because it's lost 50% of its body mass through neglect and malnutrition. So if Rabbi Meir doesn't hold that a physical change affects acquisition, then even if the animal has physically changed by losing half its body weight, the robber can return it to the original owner and say, what is yours is before you. So in that particular case, that is detrimental, and that would only come into effect if a physical change does not affect acquisition. If it is a penalty, Rabbi Meir can choose to enforce the penalty or remove it to suit the particular case. So in the case where there'd be a detrimental loss to the original owner, Rabbi Meir can say no. In that case, change, although the physical change doesn't affect acquisition and therefore it must be returned to the original owner, we are putting a further penalty where the robber now keeps it and has to make full restitution of 150 zuz to the original owner. But it's not because the physical change didn't affect acquisition. It didn't. So we're saying that if it doesn't affect acquisition, it's going to affect things in the case of deterioration. Because in the case where a physical change didn't affect acquisition with regards to appreciation, we don't really have as much of a problem with that compared to depreciation, because yes, the robber does make a certain amount of money, but it certainly means that there's no major loss for the original owner. So that was one way to look at it. And we say, well, how do we find a conclusion? So we look at the case of a person working in a haberdashery shop that's a dyer of wool or linen, and he was busy with more than one thing, and the person wanted red his processed wool dyed red, and the dyer misunderstood and dyed it black, or vice versa. Now all of a sudden there's a problem. So Rabbi Meir considers this person, as well as the Bava Kamma, what you call a it's an inadvertent thief. It's a person that actually cost you money, but not through malice or breaking the rule. They were just dozy or didn't listen properly. So therefore, in that particular case, what should happen if change does affect acquisition is that in that particular case, if change affects acquisition, the haberdashery shop owner would keep the dyed wool. Would he not? Because he made a change to the wool from the raw state to the misdyed state in the wrong color. Do you agree, guys? If the wool changed, it will affect acquisition for the haberdashery shop owner. And in fact, that's what does happen. Okay? Which means if the change does affect acquisition for the robber, this particular second brisa, but the first brisa, it doesn't affect acquisition, because if a fetus became a calf, then everything was returned to the original owner. It means that the physical change did not affect acquisition, and therefore it leaves two alternative behaviors by Rabbi Meir, which cannot be. So we're saying then, it proves then that it has nothing to do with a physical change determining ownership for the robber. Because in the case of appreciation, it's returned. In this particular case of the haberdashery owner, the robber, in inverted commas, the inadvertent robber who didn't listen and cost the person a bit of aggravation, doesn't, in that case, return it to the original owner like that stolen item. Why? Because he spent time dyeing the wool. The wrong color, maybe, but he did. Number two, he spent money on the dye. Number three, and the most important factor, is it wasn't on purpose. It wasn't a crime. It was stupidity and a lack of listening skill. And four, he'd be able to get rid of it better than a private person, because he's in the business where people come to him and ask him to dye different things. So he'll get rid of the stock eventually. But the umbrella rule is that here it was an inadvertent robber, and therefore Rabbi Meir is lenient and says he will not invoke the penalty in this case, where the dyer of a haberdashery shop has to return the improved value of the untreated wool into red dyed wool, where the original owner of the unprocessed wool has made a profit of perhaps 30 zuz from a 100 zuz piece of wool. Do you get what I'm saying, guys? So we can see there in one case, if Rabbi Meir says that everything's returned to the original owner, including the byproducts as well as the stolen article. And in another case, saying it's not returned to the original owner, but the inadvertent robber keeps it, it clearly is not a case of a physical change affecting acquisition, because in both cases, the physical change occurred from untreated wool into red wool instead of black, and from a fetus to a calf, or from a pregnant state animal to a non-pregnant state animal. So the only feature that could be different, since the rule of the same is that they both made a physical change, the animals, or the article in this case, is that Rabbi Meir has decided to, when somebody's robbed on purpose, put a penalty in place where the robber doesn't gain the appreciation. And in a case where, with the haberdashery shop, the dye owner didn't do it on purpose, and he put in time and labor and costs of dye, and he's able to get rid of it relatively quickly to another customer. All that's required in that case is that he keeps the improvement, the robber, because it's inadvertent, but he gives the cash equivalent of the untreated wool to the original owner. So that's how we dealt with it on Sunday and Monday. Does that make sense, guys? Fine. Now, Tuesday is a different case, because it's saying it now in a different way. And why would it say it in a different way? Because it's now wanting to teach us a different principle. And that's why it precedes a slightly different version of the preceding events. So it says there are those who say that this matter of whether Rabbi Meir holds that change affects acquisition was actually never a question to us. In other words, the first one put the emphasis on, does change affect acquisition for the robber, according to Rabbi Meir? That was the emphasis of the first discussion. This discussion is not that, because it's not a question to us. Because it says, for since Rav reversed the opinion cited in the Mishnah regarding the stolen animal and slaves that aged, and teaches the Mishnah as follows. So one thing we learned in the previous Mishnah is as follows. It was saying that the reason why it was inconclusive, if you realize, is there was this whole thing about an animal that aged, and a slave that aged. Because what do we do when we learn a principle of Gemara? It teaches us a whole lot of other lessons along the way. So what did it say? It says that if those that hold that a reversible change, in fact, doesn't affect acquisition. Do you get what I'm saying? We did learn an opinion like that. Where if you stole boards from Builder's Warehouse and you put it together as a chair, it's not like you planed the wood. You could unbang it and then you could return it because it's reversible. But that doesn't affect acquisition for the robber because of the biblical enactment. He can return it in the manner that he stole it. But rabbinically, the reason why we're saying that he gets to keep it, the robber, and pay the cash equivalent, is we want him to make it to Shuvah. And we know if he spent the whole weekend building it, he's not going to want to lose out all that time. So even though biblically he can return it as is, and the robber doesn't get to acquire it, he can rabbinically in order that the teshuvah process happens. So with this aged slave, that is not talking about a reversible change. It's talking about irreversible. I look in the mirror and I know that my eyesight has gone worse over the years. And it's God's kindness, because if I had clarity of how far I deteriorated look-wise in the last couple of years, I would have gotten a hell of a fright. So my eyes have aged in proportion to how my body's deteriorated. As a kindness, not to get a shock every time I've gone past the mirror. Arthur and I have had this discussion before. So what that means of it is that aging is an irreversible process, which means it's not talking about something that could be knocked back into its previous shape. So therefore, that is now both in a biblical respect and a rabbinic respect, that change affects acquisition for the robber. So what has to happen in principle is that the robber would have to keep it and make restitution at the higher value of what the slave or the animal was worth at its optimum level of strength and energy. Right. So Rabbi Meir brings the point that there's a difficulty as far as animals are concerned, and that is because he's saying that a slave is like land. You can never really steal it. It's like stealing a title deed, but you can't put land in your pocket. So it's not even an effective robbery as such. And therefore it doesn't hold by the slave issue and having to repay, make restitution back to that period of the time of robbery, because it might have been in the possession of the robber, but it was never really the robber's. It's like land. But by Rabbi Meir saying that he infers that he has this issue with regards to a slave, it means that he never brought up this issue with regards to an animal. Is that correct, guys? He only brought up the issue with the slave. And therefore, since he didn't argue with the Tana Kamma in terms of an animal, meaning his only objection was the slave because it's seen as land, not movables. Animals, he never had an objection, which means he agrees with the Tana Kamma in principle that a change does affect acquisition, the Gemara was proposing, with regards to an animal, which means that he has to, the robber gets to keep the aged animal and make restitution at the time of the robbery. Okay, but the Gemara says you can't learn Rabbi Meir like that. Okay, and the reason you can't is because you can learn that. You can learn it in a different way. You can say that, in fact, so if you want to learn it that a physical change affects acquisition, then in that particular way, you can say, fine, then in that particular case, if it's almost a penalty that Rabbi Meir imposes when the changed article is appreciated. Okay? Because what should happen then in the first brisa is that when it went from a calf to a fetus, the robber should keep it. And then what would happen is that he makes restitution at what the fetus was worth, what the cow was worth at that particular stage of pregnancy. Does that make sense? Which trimester it was? So in that particular case, it means that it's a penalty that Rabbi Meir would be holding, because in the case of an appreciation, guys, am I unstable? No, mentally unstable. Unstable.
Guys.
Now you're back to normal.
Now I'm back to
about 10 seconds you were frozen.
Yeah, it wasn't long.
Come through.
This is the last 30
5
seconds.
Yeah.
It was quite a quick one.
All right. So what we are saying here is that that first proposition that Rabbi Meir had, the way that Bryce was interpreted, that he had, and the Mishnah was interpreted, that he had a problem with the only the slaves, because it was seen as fixed property or land, but not with movable property such as an animal, means he implies that he's not arguing with the Bava Kamma, and that at the time of the robbery, before the animal aged and depreciated, the robber has to make restitution, and he gets to keep the aged animal, which means a change does affect acquisition. So it's then saying in our case, when the cow was pregnant, but now it's worth more with a calf, he only has to make restitution at the stage of the trimester the animal was in, but doesn't get to keep the appreciation of the calf. He returns everything, which is trying to prove that Rabbi Meir says there's a penalty. And the Gemara is saying in response to that, that there can't be a penalty, because you could learn this Mishnah with Rabbi Meir in a different way. How do you interpret it? You interpret it the following way. It says, and it may be that Rabbi Meir, in his response that disputes the rabbis only with regards to slaves, was not actually presenting his own opinion in this case, that he feels that a change does affect acquisition. But he was simply stating an objection to the rabbi's argument, even in accordance with their own opinions, as follows. So it's saying, guys, listen, according to me, Rabbi Meir, I personally don't have a problem that with change. Change doesn't affect acquisition for me, so I don't have an issue with it. But according to you, and you want to say that a stolen animal depreciated on account of a physical change, and that's got to be returned to the robber in its present depreciated state, that's fine. Because you say that a change does affect acquisition. But then you can't argue with me, as far as slaves are concerned, that that doesn't go back to the robber, but it goes back to the original owner, which means it doesn't affect acquisition in the case of slaves, because it's seen as land. And the rabbi's argument in return is no, they define slaves as movables, which can be stolen, just like an animal. And when they age and undergo physical change, the robber acquires them and must pay for them for their full time of robbery. So at that basis, we had no idea, because of the way you can read the Mishnah backwards and forwards, what Rabbi Meir's position is. Does he hold that a change affects acquisition? Does he hold that a change does not affect acquisition? And if you want to say that he holds that a change does affect acquisition, then in the case of a deterioration, it does belong to the robber. But in the case of appreciation, it's a problem, because that then should also go to the robber. And therefore, if it's returned to the original owner in the first brisa, it means he invokes the penalty clause. But because it's inconclusive, it was at that point we learnt about the dying of the haberdashery side. And then we came to a conclusion that it seemed that for inadvertent robbery, for a mistake, that the Rabbi Meir holds in both cases that a change affects acquisition. But when the crime was inadvertent, just not paying attention, the robber in that case, the person that dyed the wool the wrong color, gets to keep the dyed wool, because he can actually make money off it. He's got a client base, he put in time, he put in labor, but most importantly, he didn't do it on purpose, and he has to refund the original owner for the untreated wool. And therefore Rabbi Meir is lenient. The penalty is only invoked. So therefore the change affects acquisition. What's the proof? Because if a change did not affect acquisition, he would take the red dye that was untreated and give it back to the original owner. The reason the robber, in this case the person that misheard, gets to keep it is because it's changed. The physical properties have changed. and therefore it's acquired by the person that made the mistake, as long as he pays restitution of a cash equivalent of what that untreated wool was worth. So how do we explain the case of appreciation? Guys, am I still unstable?
No, you're fine.
So how do we discuss the first brasa with appreciation? That basically the products and byproducts of the robbery are returned to the original owner, is because that is for blatant, premeditated theft about doing a crime. Therefore, Rabbi Meir enforces the penalty there, but he still holds that a change effects acquisition. So that was the proof. Now, that was the first treatment of the subject matter. Now, what we did yesterday was a second treatment of the subject matter in order to teach us other principles. Guys, have I got you so far? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Has any of this been helpful at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Always.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So this I've been going with a bit mostly memory. So I hope it's been helpful. But I've learned to...
It's like a summary. It's a very good one.
Okay. So what I'm saying is if it's a poor one, the Gemara is not at fault, I'm at fault. Okay. So the different version of events that's presented to us now is it's saying, listen, there's never been a question of whether a physical change affects acquisition. That's not even an issue. Because according to Rav, he reverses the opinion cited in the Mishnah regarding the stolen animal and the slaves that aged. And he basically teaches Rav the Mishnah as follows. If one stole an animal and it aged, or slaves and they aged, he pays their value as of the time of the robbery. Those are the words of Rabbi Meir. Now, if Rav teaches us this, it means the physical change affects acquisition, because the robber ends up keeping the depreciated value of the slave or animal and has to make restitution to the original owner for what that invigorated, younger animal or slave was worth, and therefore the change affects acquisition to the detriment of the robber. That's according to Rav. The sages say something different according to Rav. In the case of slaves, the robber may say to the original owner, behold, what is yours is before you. Because, according to Rav, the Tana Kamma is saying that slaves are not seen as movables, they're seen as land. So it's obviously certain, guys, that according to Rabbi Meir, change does generally affect acquisition. So that isn't a question. In the Brisa, where he states that a robber must return the offspring and the shorn wool, it's actually a penalty that Rabbi Meir imposes. So when we inquired about Rabbi Meir's opinion, this is in fact the issue we're honing in on from yesterday, which Gavin got right, is it a case that Rabbi Meir imposes the penalty so that the robber not profit from his acquisition through change? Is it only when he acted deliberately, in other words, with intent to steal? But where he acted inadvertently, like for example with the dyed wool in the haberdashery shop, Rabbi Meir does not impose a penalty. That's one way of looking at it. There's a penalty if it's purposeful, but inadvertent, there's no penalty. The second way to look at it is the fact that if he acted inadvertently or whether he acted purposefully, either way, the penalty is enforced against him. Why? Because it could be seen that that at the end of the day, the person maybe never meant to steal, but they stole. Say, for example, somebody means to smack your car. So you might say to me, Kevin, you might turn around to me and say, well, what do you mean? The one was on purpose, the one's by accident. How can Rabbi Meir impose a penalty on the one that's accidental? So I'm going to ask you something. You're driving a car in Johannesburg, and some taxi bangs you at the back. Okay, now this wasn't premeditated. The guy just drives like an idiot. Whether or not he plotted and schemed to hit the back of your car for a month, or whether he just went through a red robot, or even not, just wasn't watching where he was going and hit your car. What difference does it make to you since you got the loss? Doesn't matter. So according to the opinion that actions dictate and it's not intent, it could be that the penalty is posed either way. If it's about intent, then the penalty is only enforced when it's a intent to steal, a deliberate act. Okay. So the Gemara says, all right, we need to resolve this inquiry. and we're going to look at doing it. Now, guys, I could go through it this evening. I'm absolutely finished. So if we can just do that tomorrow, and I hope this was okay.
Yeah, can I just ask you something, Damon?
Sure.
Or add a point? How do they? Okay, so you just gave the example of the taxi that goes into the back of somebody's car, and obviously the person that suffered the loss doesn't care if he had intention or if it was unintentional or negligent. He still suffered a loss. But how do you prove intention? That's the question. How does Rav Meir?
Excellent. So there's two points to your question. The first point is that according to one opinion, you don't have to prove it, because either way you've been physically damaged. What difference does it make? You're still at a loss. That's the one opinion. The other opinion is that intent does matter, because you can turn around and say that in the case of you dealing with a service provider and he did the thing in the wrong way, okay, you don't have to hold him to the full penalty of the law when in fact he's prepared to give you what the untreated bill was worth. You haven't lost money. The only time one really feels punitive is one feels invaded by a deliberate robber. Then when somebody breaks the law, you want to teach them a lesson so they never make that mistake again. When somebody maybe got it mixed up or whatever, you want to get your money back, but you don't have to slam the book at them, so to speak. Okay? So there it makes a difference. Am I making sense? Depends how you're holding. It really, really depends how you're holding. So we're going to see, but the question is never in doubt, according to the second explanation, that Rabbi Meir holds that a change does affect acquisition. That's not the point of the argument. It's does he see intent as counting more in addition to action? All right, guys. I hope it was.
Can I make a joke, Damon?
Sure.
So if you came on a holiday into the country, what is your intention when you walk into Cape Union Mart? Is it to buy a tent or is it not?
That's cute. That's cute.
Is that your intention to buy? Are you intent on buying a tent, Gavin?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not as wise as what Damon has just said. But,
no, it's nice.
So I have to add humor sometimes. That's my nature.
No, it's 100%.
Kevin, my brocha to you is may you know only joy and no misery. Really.
Gam lecha, gam lachem.
Gam lachem.
Yes, amen.
Gam lanu to us.
Amen.
Arthur, you're awake. Arthur went over this material with you, Damon.
We can understand you all the way through.
What's that, Arthur? A woman?
Now you meet a woman who can understand you.
And Damon and Gavin as well.
Well, Damon you already know.